Let's talk about counterexamples. As we've seen, counterexample can undermine an argument. So when we think about the role of a counterexample, it's effectively to show that the putative conclusion of the argument need not necessarily follow, that there are other ways that things could be given the premises. So remember, in a logically valid argument, you're going to find that the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. The conclusion must follow given the premises. A counterexample is a way of saying, well, that's not the case. So what do we mean by counterexample? We mean basically something like an exception to the claim that something must be the case. So if someone says, for example, all Irish people are alcoholics, this would be defeated by the existence of a non-alcoholic Irish person. So the first non-alcoholic Irish man or woman that we'd meet would serve as a counterexample to that generalization about Irish people. So we'd say, well, it's not always the case that Irish people are alcoholics because some particular candidate, non-alcoholic Irish person, isn't an alcoholic, so that person defeats the general claim. When we're looking at proofs, we're going to be thinking about counterexamples to the conclusion. And if there are counterexamples to the conclusion of an argument, that means that the argument is invalid. So why is that? Well, in an invalid argument, there simply are no counterexamples to the conclusion. The conclusion must follow. So let's take a look at this argument here. If Sam studies all night, he'd be tired. Sam is tired. So these are premises. And here's the invalid inference that takes us to this conclusion. So Sam studied all night. Why does this person, what reason do they give for saying that Sam studies all night? They say, well, the reason Sam studied all night is because he's tired, and because if he studies all night, he'd be tired. Now, to defeat the argument, you need to simply point out the possibility that Sam could be tired, and the reason for his being tired is because, let's say, he ran a marathon. So the fact that Sam would be tired if he studied all night doesn't mean that when we see a tired Sam, we can legitimately conclude that he was studying all night. So for all we know, he might have been playing video games, or he might have run a marathon, etc. So given that we're not forced, so here's the key, we're not forced to agree that he must have been studying all night, then we shouldn't accept the validity of the argument. Okay, so given what we know, there are counterexamples. So for example, we'd say, no, he might have been playing video games. This would be our counterexample. The counterexample here is consistent with these guys, the premises. So the counterexample shows that the negation of the conclusion is consistent with the premises. So what are we saying? We're saying that it doesn't follow, this conclusion doesn't follow, because if you negate it, if you say it's not the case that Sam studied all night, that would also be consistent with the premises. And then that clearly can't be the case in a valid piece of logical inference or valid logical argument. So if there are no counterexamples to the conclusion of an argument, then we know that the conclusion, and if we know that the conclusion always follows from the premises, then we say the argument's valid. So how do we go about showing that an argument is invalid? Well, we can show that there are counterexamples to the conclusions and that these counterexamples to the conclusions are consistent with the premises. Simple as that.